that I'm Chief Executive of the Port of London Authority and also Chair of Maritime UK, which is the umbrella body for the sector. And I'm going to start actually by just giving a little bit of orientation around the Port of London and a bit of background just to sort of put the more detailed comments into some context. So our job fundamentally is what it says on this slide. So we protect and improve the tidal Thames for all. And the key words there are obviously protect and improve. We've got a fundamental job on the safety of life, safety of navigation, and also the improvement of the tidal Thames in all aspects, including the sustainability of the tidal Thames. A little bit of history. So we were founded in 1908 as a port authority to bring order to chaos from the previous very deregulated situation on the Thames in London. The Thames was the biggest port in the world in the 19th century, and in fact until 1937. And the Port of London Authority was established to bring sort of order to chaos. And throughout that history, I won't go through all the detail, but throughout the history, we've invested in the river in order to ensure that the port maintains its relevance and its impact in the world of the day. Most recently, there's been a huge sort of shift of the port to the east, with containerisation in the 1960s. The old London docks closed, including some of the ones around in Greenwich where we are now, and the port moved eastwards. With the Port of Tilbury, the biggest terminal until 2015, and then Dubai World's major investment in London Gateway, which is now the UK's third biggest container terminal from 2013 onwards. And that process of investment and change continues. A little bit on the geography. I've just shown you the map already, but we're 150 kilometres or 95 miles from Teddington in the west out to the North Sea in the east. Some major infrastructure along that length, of course, includes the Thames Barrier, keeping London safe from the impacts of flooding. Our operational centre in Gravesend, and then our two biggest terminals shown there, which are London Gateway and Port of Tilbury. Now, just a little bit more detail. Our mission is to be a thriving river and home to the UK's number one port. We are a trust port, which means that we don't have shareholders. We invest for our stakeholders. And that's very important when it comes to investing in infrastructure. And I would argue that the trust port status gives us a very strong position to take a leadership role on sustainability because we can take that very long-term view. And if you think about it, the original word of the word sustainable was about long-term. And then more recently, in recent decades, it's become particularly around environmental sustainability, but fundamentally about the long-term. We work across industry and government to support growth and sustainability across the whole of the Thames Estuary region. A few kind of numbers, facts and figures. So the tidal Thames is the busiest port in the UK for passengers. Last year we carried about 9 million passengers on the River Thames. Also the busiest port for inland freight, around 3 million tonnes of inland freight. That itself is a contribution to sustainability in the sense that one of our goals is to get light freight off of congested roads in the capital and onto the most sustainable form of transport, onto the river. We're also a broader sort of sense of sustainability, social sustainability. We're a really important place for activity. 645 sporting events happened on the river last year, and one of our goals is to increase the diversity and the reach of those sporting activities. And important to say, and I'll just say a word about safety in a minute, 0 serious navigational incidents in that entire jurisdiction last year, which is obviously very important. I put this up just because we really like this picture because it's so iconic. Obviously, we've got the House of Parliament there. We're boasting about the fact we are the biggest port in the UK, 51.6 million tonnes of goods carried in 2023. And we've recently just before the new MPs arrived back, put some banners on one of our barges in that location, just to make sure that MPs are aware of that. And it's obviously that's good for us, but it's also about tackling a wider issue actually in our political system, which is what we might call sea blindness, sort of lack of awareness of the river. And I suspect many of those MPs turning up in Parliament and going out onto the terrace of the House of Commons or the House of Lords don't immediately think they're in a port. They think about the fact they're on a river, but they are in fact, of course, within a port. So just reminding them of that is one of the reasons for doing that. Safety of navigation is a key function for us. We are fundamentally about the safety of life, and we run a range of services from pilotage to navigation, our navigation centre, to ensure that we achieve that goal. So I'm going to come on now to talk in a bit more detail about the brief around sustainability and smart infrastructure. We have something called the Thames Vision, which sets out our goals out to 2050. And we think about our responsibility for the tidal Thames under three headings. We call them the trading Thames, in other words, the role the river plays in hosting the UK's biggest port and in carrying inland freight. Destination Thames, the role of the river in supporting tourism and river activity and recreation and so on. And the natural Thames, which is the role of the estuary in providing ecosystem services and as a place for the natural environment. So I'm going to talk about some examples under each of those three themes, speaking to the brief. I'm just going to move this screen a little bit closer actually, because I can't quite see the slides very detailed unless I crane my neck and look at the slides behind me. There we go, that's better. That's a bit easy for me. Okay, so the first thing to come to, the natural Thames. So as I say, natural Thames, clean air, water and land supporting wildlife. Our goal is a clean river, not a cleaner river, a clean river, free of sewage, waste and other forms of pollution. Now, one aspect of that, a very important aspect which has been very high profile for us over the last few years, is air quality. And in fact, speaking here in Greenwich, that is particularly relevant because one of the major sites where we have a lot of public concern is our cruise terminal for cruise vessels coming into London to our moorings in Greenwich. And so back in 2018, we were the first port to develop and publish an air quality strategy. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, fundamentally and most importantly, we started by saying, what's the evidence base? How do we develop an understanding of what the problem is that we're trying to tackle? And then we can come up with some solutions and the infrastructure requirements to do that. So the first thing we did was to invest in, if you like, small-scale sustainable infrastructure, which is a series of air quality monitoring stations along the tidal Thames, and particularly around the cruise terminal, but also at other sites. And from that, we then produced an emissions inventory, which enabled us to understand the different pollutants, where they're produced, at what times of day, and so on. So this is what that looks like, our emissions inventory. Using our activity data from vessels, the AIS data collected from vessels moving on the river, and linking that to the network of monitoring stations and the air quality data, we're able to identify hotspots in terms of emissions along the river. And obviously that then enables us to build some interventions based upon that evidence base. We were the first port in the UK to approach it in that systematic way. And I should say that at our public meetings where we interact with members of the community who live alongside the river and our stakeholders, this has been incredibly helpful because some of the concerns that people are raising about air quality and the river, we were able to show them very directly the pollutants caused by the river in their community. So it's a very important part of engagement, which I think is a very important aspect of the UN sustainability goals. So as I say, that evidence base then enabled us to develop our plan for tackling air pollution. And I won't go through these 5 headings in detail. You can look on our website if you're interested in finding more information at our air quality strategy. But very much it builds upon that investment in the evidence base and in the infrastructure to enable us to come up with a coherent plan. The second example I'm going to mention is now moving on to net zero. Now, just to say, we started our approach to net zero transition by looking at the Port of London Authority and our own organisation's emissions on the simple basis that you can't start to convene people and talk about net zero for an entire port if you don't have something to say positively about your own organisation's approach. So we have been investing in our own small-scale infrastructure to decarbonise our own emissions. And you'll see there the PLA's carbon footprint, which has fallen dramatically over the last 10 years. To around 15% of its previous value. Now, how have we done that? Fundamentally through shifting our fleet of work vessels to biofuel, which has required installing new bunkering facilities and transitioning our fueling stations to biofuel on the river. We haven't primarily done that through electric vessels as yet, but we are looking at future electric vessels. Of course, one of the challenges, I'm sure you've covered this in other sessions, one of the challenges for looking at EV solutions for workboats is to understand the operating environment. In our case, we may have vessels out in the estuary for long periods of time, doing surveys and so on, and therefore actually at the moment the EV solutions haven't proven viable. So we've been looking at the moment at a biofuel solution for our workboats. That's been the most fundamental aspect of our reduction in our carbon footprint, and there are some supporting infrastructure developments as well around electrification of our fleet, solar photovoltaics on our buildings, and EV charging. Actually, they account for a pretty small part of our carbon footprint. The vessels is where most of it's at. Now that in a way sort of set us up then to do the bigger piece of work, which is to look at what our role is in supporting the transition of the wider port, the biggest port in the UK, as the Port Authority. Now again, what we've done on this is to focus very strongly on the evidence base as a starting point. And we've invested with RightShip, the company which has pioneered the collection of data in relation to safety globally, but more latterly has also pioneered the collection of data on sustainability. We have partnered with RightShip to develop a maritime emissions portal for the tidal Thames, which you can access again via the PLA's website. And this provides really granular data to understand the source of emissions coming into the river. And you can then map that geographically as that screenshot shows, but also map it in other ways, such as by type of vessel movement, to see whether it's when vessels are alongside or whether they're manoeuvring, where the biggest emissions are. And one of the interesting things to emerge from that is how significant tugs are within port boundaries. So again, that shone a spotlight on something which we might have anecdotally thought about, but actually now we have the data to support. So we've developed the emissions portal. So do have a look on our website. We're the first port in the UK to have that sort of system. And off the back of that, we've produced and published this year our Net Zero River Plan, which is looking at how the port as a whole can move towards decarbonisation. Now, there are four sort of legs of that plan. One is supporting the transition to alternative fuels, which is looking at all the issues around bunkering and the provision of fuel for deep sea vessels coming into port. A second is the regulatory side of that, and this is where we think we've got a particular role to play as a trust port and a regulator to understand and to transition the regulations which are written almost exclusively at the moment in terms of fossil fuels towards different forms of hydrogen fuel and other forms of alternative fuel, whether it comes to bunkering or safe transportation, working with the classification societies, with the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and our own regulations as a port authority to make sure that we are ready for that. Thirdly, to look at financing, and that includes looking at sources of government funding as well as private sector funding. And fourthly, the use of data, which is both the Maritime Emissions Portal I've already shown, and other forms of data that we need to collaborate on to support that transition. Our role as the PLA is very much to act as the convener of a lot of other organisations to try and achieve that for the broader Thames. Now, coming on more specifically to infrastructure within that, one of the projects which is being taken forward as part of that strategy is what we call Electric Thames. So this is a collaboration with Marine Zero Company, with UK Power Networks and LCP Delta, which is to use funding from the Ofgem Strategic Innovation Fund to explore in a lot more detail the requirements and the power requirements for the electrification of vessels on the Thames. Now, one of the aspects of that is obviously looking at the demand side as well and understanding from the operators the different operating requirements of different types of vessel. Electric propulsion is obviously not a panacea, but in many instances in inland waterways it can be part of the solution, as well as alongside solutions for shore power for ocean-going vessels. So the study is essentially looking at four things: the regulatory issues, how do we engage stakeholders who are involved in that process to come up with a solution, and then looking at both the demand and the supply side, which will enable us then to have a cost-benefit analysis of how to electrify the Thames. This is, again, very data-rich, this project. So at the moment, one part of that is using the PLA's AIS data to map the vessel movements along the river, again, to understand what the likely matching of supply and demand is. And then once we've got that data, we can clearly then link it to UK Power Networks, where they've able to map the availability of significant amounts of power alongside the river in order to put those two things together. So this is very much work in progress at the moment. We're looking forward to working with UK Power Networks in particular on it. They've got an absolutely key role, and I think it's important to say that UKPN are much more sort of plugged in, I think, now to looking at the sort of maritime context. They clearly have got a huge agenda nationally to look at, whether it's all forms of transport or other forms of industrial use and domestic use. But it's really good to see UKPN looking really seriously at the maritime space. From that, we will then develop a more detailed plan. I'm not going to go through this again. There's more details of this on our website to be able to develop a greater understanding of what the requirements are. But again, I suppose the points I really want to draw out for the sort of brief I was given were fundamentally, I think this is about working in partnership with organisations, diverse organisations, to come up with solutions to complex problems. And secondly, it's about using data in a really smart and intelligent way. And only then can you decide what is the most intelligent investment in sustainable infrastructure. Now, I'm just going to come on to a couple of other examples. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got our Thames Vision, and I've covered a couple of the projects and actions under our Natural Thames strand. This is under our Trading Thames strand, which is supporting the position of the UK's largest port and ultimately producing net zero emissions. And I wanted just to talk about something we call the Marine Centre Transformation Programme, which is essentially about future-proofing the port for growth, with a focus on a new port control centre for better navigational safety, a £10 million investment which we're making right now, which I think very squarely sits within the smart and sustainability space in terms of infrastructure. Why are we doing it? Well, fundamentally, we want a more up-to-date system, a new VTS system, which is more resilient. We want to put everything into one place. At the moment, we've got two navigation centres, and we're moving them both into one single centre for the river, so the sort of one river, one port concept. That will enable us to improve our operational efficiency. We're also improving our sustainability performance in the sense that we're refurbishing a building and reducing its carbon footprint at the same time. But fundamentally, that will enable us to take a holistic view of navigation in the sort of safest possible way, help us to manage the movement of vessels in the most efficient way, which contributes significantly to both safety and sustainability, and using technology to do that. We've chosen Kongsberg as our system developer, and we're currently in the process, or Kongsberg are currently in the process of implementing that system. We've installed a bunch of new hardware as well to support that. And it's very much about making sure that we're ready for a future which involves significant autonomy. Now, there's obviously a lot of talk. I suspect you've had sessions at this conference and certainly touched on autonomous vessels quite a lot. Our view is that world is definitely coming. I think full autonomy for big ships is a pretty long way away, but I certainly think we're moving to increased vessel autonomy is the words we're using. We see fewer and fewer people on the bridge of ships, and we need greater and greater capacity for shore-to-ship communication. And that's obviously about safety, but it also supports other goals. So that's very much what this investment is about. One part of that as well, I put this, I thought, is this really relevant to this particular topic? But I think it is, because I think the human dimension sometimes gets a little bit forgotten when we talk about smart and sustainable infrastructure. And of course, part of developing effective infrastructure is making sure that the people who operate it have good working environments and are bought into the process. And so we put a lot of effort into thinking through the space in which this will happen, the ergonomics for people who are doing 12-hour shifts, so that it's a good experience on a long-term basis. And those are a bunch of cardboard pretend screens there, just to sort of get to be able to sort of map and illustrate to people, what it will look and feel like. Which is a really important part, I think, of any kind of infrastructure investment to think about that dimension. Now, just last but not least, I'm sort of coming close to the end, I think, of the time slot for speaking, allowing a few minutes for questions. The last of our sort of themes is what we call Destination Thames, which is what we say is a place to live, visit, play and enjoy. And any of you who know the river and the tidal Thames, I hope sort of know that. If you live in London, you'll obviously kind of be experiencing the tidal Thames regularly, but we also have millions of visitors to London, a huge proportion of whom want to go out onto the river, or at least go to sites by the river, and we need to engage people in that. Now, what does sort of smart and sustainable look like in relation to that aspect of our role? Well, the example I thought I'd choose was what we call master planning. So we are going through a process at the moment of looking at all 23 boroughs that are alongside the tidal Thames to map, using GIS in quite granular detail, to map what the interaction is between the land and the river across that whole 95 miles of jurisdiction that I spoke about at the start. And what's the point of that? Well, partly it's about producing more accessible data so that local authorities, other stakeholders, members of the community can engage with the river online in a GIS kind of format. It's then also about using that to allow better decision making. So obviously local planning authorities, private sector investors, others are making decisions all the time about land use, and we need to try and influence that to say, and don't forget the river, it's a really important part of our infrastructure. If we want a sustainable city in the broadest sense, we need to make sure that we're using the green lung or the blue lung of the river in a sensible way, for freight, for passengers, for recreation, for community enjoyment. So the master plan really kind of sits at the core of understanding how the river as a piece of infrastructure relates to the broader community. So, how are we doing it? Well, as I say, we're working through the river in bits. We can't do it all at once. So there's a map showing all the boroughs who are along the river, 23 of them. We are taking about 5 a year and working through a master planning process with each of them. Very intensive engagement with stakeholders in each borough to seek their input as to, well, what do you want from the river and the land alongside it? And then mapping it using GIS to come up with something quite granular. The interest from stakeholders has been fantastic. We launched this as something we wanted to do as the PLA, but an incredible number of local communities and local boroughs have clearly found it incredibly useful because they've engaged with the process. Some of the local authorities have never seen their community from the river before. We've taken them out onto the river to do part of the engagement process. And again, that aspect of engagement is a really key part of thinking about long-term sustainability, because ultimately local authorities, if they're making decisions, for example, in local plans, are making decisions about the sustainability of their boroughs, and they need to be doing that using evidence of how the river or port, or any port I would say, fits into that picture. The first stretch we did was Bexley. We chose Bexley because there's a lot going on. It's very diverse. It's an outer London borough with a huge mix of things, from passenger transport to industrial uses, to the planned biggest carbon capture and storage facility inside the M25 at Corey Riverside, and lots of opportunity areas. So we started with the London Borough of Bexley. And this is kind of what it looks like. Again, if you're interested in seeing more information about this, just do go online and find at the PLA's website further details of the master plan, and you can click on these interactive maps and it will take you to each individual site and give you information and GIS data about it and photos and so on. As I say, the point of doing that is to enable us to then make more sustainable decisions in the long run about the use of our river infrastructure. I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to say. What next? Well, I think what next is probably for you to ask me in terms of questions. But the thing I really wanted to get across, I suppose three really key messages I wanted to make were, firstly, that evidence base is really, really important when it comes to smart and sustainable infrastructure decisions. The second is, do not forget the people dimension, because I think that is sometimes slightly neglected when we think about both infrastructure and sustainability. And the third is the importance of place. And in our case, we're very clear because we're responsible for a single place, which is the tidal Thames and the 95 miles of it. And which solution works for which location is often very place dependent, and that's why it's really important to understand the detail of the place you're thinking about before making any kind of decisions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So we heard this morning about electric Thames, and again, as the custodian of the river, as the Port Authority, what are the main challenges that you're facing as the people responsible for the river in getting that thing delivered? Because speaking back to my government days, I remember how difficult it was to get grandfather rights sorted out for historic vessels on the Thames. How are we going to get that shift from getting those vessels to change their characteristics and become sustainable vessels that on the river and cleaning up the air for everyone that lives around it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gareth. I think I suppose the first thing I'd say is that we need to understand the grid issues in detail, and we need to know where the power can be located at the most reasonable cost, and that's fundamentally the work we're doing with UK Power Networks. Clearly, there are some sort of financial and practical constraints. So in fact, if I just take one example, we looked at installing shore power for the Greenwich ship tier, and it's a midstream mooring, about 400 metres, I think, from where we're here. And actually, the cost of doing that absolutely prohibitive. The nearest substation is quite a way away. Then you've got to get the power into the midstream mooring. So if you were doing a classic cost benefit analysis, or to be more technical, looking at sort of marginal abatement cost curves for different locations, you wouldn't choose there. You would choose location where there's power closer to the river already, where there's a good source of demand. So I think the first thing is looking at the power requirements. The second, I think, is working with the operators, the Thames operators, to understand their requirements and what investment decisions they're going to make. Now, of course, it's a lot easier for bigger operators. If you've got an operator with one or two vessels, it's challenging. But some of the bigger operators are making significant strides in this. I mean, Thames Clippers, I guess, has been one of the leaders on the River Thames, certainly, and other operators, Woods, City Cruise, are all looking at this. So I think it's then just it's kind of simple in one sense, isn't it? it? It's mapping where's the supply, where's the demand, and these things will work. Now, at the moment, it's difficult, as you sort of alluded to make it work as a business case without some kind of government support. And I think that will be important. Equally, given the sort of constraints on the government budget, we're going to need to find some solutions in the private sector as well. So I suppose the three answers to your question are: where's the supply, where's the demand, and where's the money?
Have we heard that before? Okay, but again, we heard from Gina earlier about ESG, and from the Thames 2050 plan and everything, it's very clear that the Port of London Authority is taking that ESG responsibilities very clearly. And again, something I used to champion to when I was briefing ministers on Port of London Authority is again that you were the first port to have a hybrid pilot cutter. And again, it's taking that step and leading by example, close to now, leader. Again, is that, are you a port that is desperately trying to set the example to other ports around the country and indeed around the world on how we can do things better?
Yes, I mean it's interesting, that one actually. Let's full disclosure that we had real challenges actually with operating the hybrid pilot cutter, and it's an interesting example of where, if you do pioneer something, it was the first hybrid pilot cutter in the UK, it's not always straightforward. So you have to, as an organisation, and the leadership of the organisation, the board in our case, has to be comfortable with innovation being difficult and not always going smoothly. Yes, I think we there are certainly areas where we feel we've got a role to play in leading. There are others where our natural position is to be a fast follower, and I guess you've got to kind of judge those those spaces you want to be in. You can't be a leader in everything. As an organisation, you have to choose, I think.
Have we got any questions from the floor for Robin? Silence descended. Again, just talking about the link between society and the sea. You've got a massive range, much bigger than any other port in the country. 95 miles. And again, residents in very desirable properties, all the way along that stretch of river. And again, it's that impact, as you say, with the amount of mixed traffic that's on the river, from having a cruise ship moored in Grange Reach, right up to the smallest and most pleasurable antique vessels going up beyond to Richmond and Hampton Court and beyond. Again, it's such a challenge, isn't it, to get everyone happy and also deliver clean air, along such a long stretch. Which is why it's so interesting as well to see, the metrics that you're doing. So is big data, a big driver in delivering change?
It is, yes. I think, I guess one of the best examples of that was our use of air quality data. But certainly, data is fundamental. But going to your point about communities and kind of trying to balance the sort of competing issues, I guess that's what makes it interesting. Trying to do that as any organisation, as a port authority in our case, and I guess the truth is that sustainability is not always that simple, is it? In the sense that there may be there are examples where you can sort of say, well, actually, yes, this is really good from a net zero transition point of view, but there are trade-offs in terms of local impacts. Noise impacts, for example. So we're very keen to get freight onto the river. If you are in a community that's right beside the place where freight is being taken off the road and onto the river, the net impact, you could argue, from a analytical point of view, is positive. But actually, if your house happens to be right next to that facility, they won't be positive for you necessarily. So we have to kind of be mindful of these things and try and find solutions which are the best in the round, but also pay particular attention, I think, to our local residents and our local communities. And I think sometimes the data really helps with that. In fact, with the Greenwich ship tier, when we had a lot of discussion with the residents there about the impact of the cruise ships, the data showed us that actually the cruise ships, when they were in port, had negligible impact on local air quality. which was very reassuring for
Yeah.
people, because if you're worried about the impact of air pollution on your family and yourself, we can now say, well, actually these cruise ships are not a significant factor. The A2 is a lot bigger factor. But so the data, I think, is really helpful, but I think also you still need to engage with people, because sometimes I think organisations tend to fall back on data, but if you're in a local community, you're not necessarily going to delve down to 13 pages into somebody's website to find that out, are you?
Yeah.
We also need to go out and make sure that we talk to people and explain things in a clear way, I think.
Mm. Gina, go for your life.
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, I couldn't agree more about the communication point. I mean, I think there's a risk with anything that's related to sustainability, that because it's perceived, we might perceive it as a good thing, and therefore everybody else should. And maybe they won't see it like that. So I think the onus is definitely still on an organisation to make sure it's out explaining itself, making people understand why it's trying to do things, because very few infrastructure investments are 100% positive for 100% of the people, right? So and the second point is I think the first thing that comes to mind in answer to your question is governance really matters. So I think if you are, who are you accountable to and what's their attitude to risk? In our case, we're very fortunate in the sense that we don't have shareholders who might be, and not all shareholders are concerned with very short-term returns, are they? But many are. In our case, we're responsible to our stakeholders, and we can take a very long-term view, which means that we can perhaps take a bit more risk around innovation, around sustainability, than if we were absolutely focused on sort of short-term gains. So I think governance is one aspect of that. I guess the second is having a portfolio. So I guess if I pitched up at our board and every innovation project went wrong, that wouldn't be too great for me. But we're always doing quite a few things at any one time, and therefore you can accept that that some things are not always going to go perfectly well on the innovation space. This is certainly something we're learning in relation to government funding. Gareth will know this from his time in government, that a lot of government funding in the maritime space has been in these kind of competitions when organisations pull together a consortium, bid in, win some money, and then try and deliver whatever it is they said they were going to do. I think there is a bit of an issue for government not to rush that, so that we're not sort of rushing together bids that are then difficult to deliver. But equally, government has to sometimes accept that not every project it funds will work out. That's kind of the point of innovation, I guess, isn't it? Yeah.